Let's talk about the way we think about the environment. The way that we define our role and our relationship with the environment matters a lot when it comes to how we act, what laws we enact, and how our quality of life is on this planet. So even though this is a short video, I want you to know that there are entire branches of environmental and social sciences that deal in human values surrounding the environment. So as we go through this video, you may really disagree or sympathize with certain viewpoints, and that's great. That means that you have your own opinion. Just remember that all these ways of thinking are valid, and each has its own built-in values that make sense to the people who hold them. So if you find one that you're really strongly against, try to think of the motivation behind it and what aspects of the human-nature relationship is being valued and why that's so at odds with your own values. First, let's talk about a very popular viewpoint at around the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. That idea is called Utilitarian Conservation, and it had some very powerful proponents like President Teddy Roosevelt in that left image and the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, in the right image. Both of these people really loved and valued and spent a lot of time in America's wild places. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to designate land as national park, and he did this with the hope that more people would see these amazing natural places and come to them. But that was the emphasis. Human use of natural resources. All of these natural wonders were assigned as resources and became a question of economics. How could these resources benefit us, and what did it cost us to preserve them? In this view, nature was a resource, and its resources should be managed by people so that they can be used for the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. This idea of resource management is crucial to conservation of these natural places. And if these natural places hadn't been monetized or turned into resources, it is very unlikely that people in the government who didn't love nature as much wouldn't have brought or bought into the idea of preserving them. But at the same time of utilitarian conservation, there was pushback from some very famous scientists and naturalists like Aldo Leopold, a professor, researcher, and Audubon Club director, and John Muir, who was a fierce defender of Yosemite National Park, and many others. The pushback was really on the emphasis of utilitarian conservation being human use. The argument was that plants, animals, and ecosystems have intrinsic value outside of how useful they are to us, and that they have every right to exist undisturbed, as much as we do. This view was called Biocentric Conservation, and it emphasized humans' role in conserving and protecting wild places as wild, and not only preserving them for future human use. Ecosystems are seen as a community or a system that has value outside of currency in this viewpoint. Biocentric conservation was not as popular with the powerful people in our country as utilitarian conservation, and so it never really took hold as far as policy or government agencies' guiding principles went. But it did have a large long-term impact on our culture. You could argue that one of the guiding principles of Western culture through most of its history was that the earth was created for human use. And then having these famous people push back on this really sowed the seeds for a different way of thinking about the environment and our relationship to it, which has changed our attitudes even through to today. Now, in the mid-20th century, there was a revolution in environmental thinking, and it was spurred by a scientist named Rachel Carson, who discovered that a common and widely used pesticide called DDT was literally poisoning ecosystems that humans relied on for crops, and that it was poisoning those of us who interacted with those ecosystems. Now, this was revolutionary. Before this, the prevailing thought was that really nothing humans did in nature could have a large enough impact to actually change an ecosystem, and even if it did, it was unlikely to have a large enough negative impact that it could affect us. But Rachel Carson brought us clear evidence that we were wrong about that, and that any kind of conservation efforts we need to make have to take human impacts on the environment and our role in changing these ecosystems very seriously. And that brings me to sustainable development, which I would argue is the prevailing ideology in environmental science today. This way of thinking says that humans are not as separate from nature as we once believed, and acknowledges the close ties between human conditions and our ability to make good choices in sustainability. So think about this. Can someone who is starving, or someone has a sick child they can't find care for, or is dying from poor water quality, do these people even have time to consider the distant future, let alone prioritize the future health of nature? I mean, no way, right? They're living day to day, doing everything they can to meet their basic needs and the basic needs of their families. They don't have the time or the resources to consider the future, and that's why social justice needs to be a part of environmental science. I would say that the one goal of environmental science is to increase the health and well-being of all life on Earth, including humans. And so we have to care about issues that negatively impact the quality of human life just as much as we need to worry about the ways to increase the number of orcas in the pods of Puget Sound or combat climate change. As we have done more and more research on humans and the environment, we've found that places in the world with higher social progress, more social justice, and more support programs also tend to have the highest environmental quality, and that cultures with lower income tend to have poorer ecological health, which directly leads to more ecological and health risks. So we need to look at the whole picture. Humans are a part of nature. We're a part of this planet. Okay, now that's the history of environmental thinking over the last 150 years or so in four slides. Whew, what a ride.